I'm now going to introduce the next slot in this afternoon's session, where we're going to have 3 speakers, plus me, very, very briefly, focusing on design codes and the National Model Design Code. And then hopefully we'll have time for a couple of questions. But I wanted to introduce first David Rudlin, Director of Urban Design at BDP, who was instrumental in writing the National Model Design Code alongside my predecessor in this role, Andy von Bradsky, who I think is here this afternoon. But David's going to talk to us about the National Model Design Code and some of the thinking behind it that will influence the work to come.
Thank you very much. And let me see if this moves on. It's still very strange to see my name up there against BDP. I'm now Director of Urban Design for BDP, as having previously been obviously at URBED. Sarah's brief for this presentation was to assume that you've all seen me present in National Model Design Code in the past, including the video where I get interrupted by my dog and both my dog and Siri, and it was recorded. So the brief was not to cover that material, but to actually think about the way that a design code is different to a design guide, why it mandates us doing things differently. So I wanted to start with a thought experiment, and to do this we had to imagine 2 people in different rooms, and the person in the first room on the left hand side there is to design something, but they're not allowed to make it. Or what they have to do is they have to write a set of instructions for the person in the second room to make it. Now you must further consider that the person in the second room thinks they're a better designer than the person in the first room. The person in the second room isn't convinced that he should be or she should be constrained by the rules written by the person in the first room. And we also need to consider the fact that there may be many people in the second room. There may be many different elements to this, and each of them have a separate client as well, none of whom have any great respect for the person in the first room. Now, the person in the first room is, of course, an urban designer. This is my job, and the tragedy of the urban design profession is it hasn't realised this. Urban designers think that they're designing things, and when people don't build what urban designers design, most of what urban designers design are beautiful places. They don't get built, and when they don't get built, what urban designers tend to do is just draw them in brighter colours and shout louder and write design guides to say how it should be, and say, why aren't people building what we're designing? And the tragedy, as I say, is the fact that they don't realise that what they're doing. The reason that Wren's plan for London, as the Minister said, didn't get built was that he thought he designed it as a thing, as opposed to a set of instructions for other people to implement, which is what urban design is about. So that is basically what a design code is. It's a set of instructions written by the person in the first room for all the people in the second room who are building this. And the key thing about a guide is that it focuses on what we think good design should look like. The key thing about a code is it focuses on the process by which that good is created. And that's the fundamental difference. So what makes a code different? Now, we can talk about whether these are good things or not, but when we did the National Model Design Code with Andy von Bradsky, who's here, we looked at coding elsewhere in the world. I've put Miami up now rather than Bordeaux, which we use. And if you're in a place with a code like this, it's very simple. So you click on the zone where your building is, and it downloads a set of rules. And those rules, and you can see the zones down the right-hand side. The rules are simple, they are definitive, there is no discretion. Less discretion, less debate, less delay. And in France, one of the things we said is that you can go into a planning office in France and get permission over the counter for a small development because you're in line with the rules. Now, whether or not you think it's a good thing depends which room you're in, I suspect. Whether you think that it's constraining to you as designers or whether it's liberating in terms of you know exactly what is going to be allowed and therefore you've got the freedom to do it. The key thing about codes is that definitiveness is in there. So it says words like must and should, and it doesn't say things like shall seek to or where appropriate, or as Rob was just telling me earlier, when people put in must in but then say must consider. No, that doesn't cut. Yeah, you have to be definitive, you have to say quite clearly what it is you mean, and it has to be measurable by percentages of figures and so on and so forth. So the key point about this is that, it's constraining to you as designers, and I say you thinking I'm talking to a room full of architects, but it's also constraining to planners. The thing about an urban design code is once it's written, the planner can't say, well, oh, I'm not sure, I like that. Or can you go away and have a look at this again? It gives you confidence on both sides. It constrains the planner, but it also constrains the designer. It gives you a set of rules within which you're working. Now, that brings up the key issue, as it always does, of flexibility. Every client I've ever had has said, oh, but they need your plan to be flexible, by which they mean they need the right to ignore it at some point in the future if it's not convenient to do so. And the thing about coding is it builds in flexibility. This is the fundamental point about coding. It's flexibility within fixed parameters. The code sets the parameters for development, and hopefully does so in not a huge amount of detail. And we may disagree in some elements about how detailed code should be. But within that, designers then have freedom to work within those parameters. And the idea is that you create the freedom by creating these very fixed parameters with a loose fit opportunity to build within them. The question, I think, hanging over all of this is it may work in Miami, it may work in Bordeaux, but can it be made to work within our planning system? And our planning system, I'm not going to do a critique of the planning system now, but it isn't built for design codes in the way that it works at the moment. It is based upon discretion, it's based upon politics, it's based upon debate, and all those are really good things. Those are the strengths of the system as opposed to, say, the French or the Miami system. And yet, the whole point about design codes is it takes away some of those freedoms. You have absolutely intense consultation in the preparation of the code, but once the code is agreed, you don't consult on stuff because it's fixed. And I think there's an issue there within the planning system that we haven't yet quite got our hands around. And this brings me on to the issue of area types. Now, when the first, not the pathfinders, but the initial pilots were done for the design code, one of the report done by Matthew Carmona looking at those said that area types are lovely and probably useful, but not essential. That they could become part of it, but actually lots of authorities found them very difficult and didn't do them. Now, the point about design codes, if you're going to be definitive, you have to have area codes. Imagine doing a code for height of buildings across a district. What are you going to say? Because the heights in the town centre are not going to be the same in the heights in the suburb or in the rural areas. You have to have different rules for each area. If you don't have area types, you end up with a design guide. You have to say heights will be appropriate to the local context. Things like that. If you want to say the height should be 3 stories, you have to have an area type in order to say which bit of the area that rule applies to. So area types are really important, absolutely essential in my view to codes. The question is, how do you create them? And I think one of the problems that authorities have had is how do we generate these area codes? It's a lot of work. And fortunately, we have an opportunity now, and Sergio Porter's in the room down here from the University of Strathclyde, who've developed this urban morphometric system, which can actually use an algorithm to generate a first pass of area types. At BDP, we're working on a code for Lichfield District Council now, and we're just about to take delivery of the first pass of area types for the whole of Lichfield District. And the diagram down on the right-hand side here, you can actually cut the number of area types depending on how many you want. If you go at the bottom of that, you end up with 20 area types. If you go towards the top, you've got 3 or 4. And this is a tool which I think is going to be really helpful in helping places generate their area types. And the final point I want to make in terms of this is that we talk a lot about character, and everyone agrees that obviously we need to fit in with local character, but lots of the areas where I have worked over the years, the local character is frankly not particularly nice. Local character isn't always the best thing in the world. Some areas are actually quite ugly, and then are we creating new development which reflects that ugly local character? The whole point about coding and the whole point about area types is it's a positive statement of what we want the area to be, one which is developed with local people, not simply a replication of what's there at the moment. And so, again, in the office, we're developing these questionnaires and spreadsheets and worksheets to use with local communities so that they can go through the characters of their areas, shuffle the ones that they like and shuffle the ones they don't like, and then start to develop the rules for their area type as they wish it to be. so that you started to balance the existing character with a new character that you're looking to create. So going back to our two people in the two different rooms, if we get it right, the person in the second room does not feel constrained by this, but the person in the first room can see that the strategy and the vision they're creating is reflected in what gets built. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Succinct, clear, and excellent graphics, everything we want a design code to be. So I'm going to talk now very briefly about some of the testing we've been doing in the department, working with local authorities, testing aspects of design coding as well as preparing design codes. So in 2021, we had a 6-month program to test the draft National Model Design Code. So the 16 local authorities we were working with weren't preparing full design codes, but testing aspects of the coding process. They looked at very different geographies and working at very different scales. Just highlighting some of the key points of feedback that we had from that program that informed our current work. What was really critical is allowing enough time, having the right skills and funding in place to prepare design codes. Setting ambitions is vital, being clear about what you want early on in the process, even in challenging areas. Giving code status is important, giving them teeth, giving it weight in the planning system. And lastly, just to highlight also the importance of the role of local leadership, key to influencing, bringing stakeholders together with a common purpose. So a handful of the 16 planning authorities did prepare some design codes, but that really wasn't enough if we were to try and deliver our ambitions for mandating codes across all authorities through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. So in March last year, we selected 21 local authorities and 4 neighbourhood planning groups to work over a 12-month period to produce design codes. And that was looking at design codes at all scales, from authority-wide right down to site-specific. So the aim of the programme is to identify exemplary codes and share the learning widely. So these next 3 slides are just a snapshot of some of the work the Pathfinders have been doing at different stages of the coding process. And I have to say it in no way does justice to the hard work that them and their design teams have been doing over the last 9 months and will be doing over the next few months ahead. So this slide looks at 3 different Pathfinders and the work they've been using to analyse their baseline information to understand where and what to code. It's really important at the early stages to understand local character, as David just said, not just what's there, but actually what a place might become and how your knowledge of a place can inform what changes might happen in the future. Also thinking about things like heritage, biodiversity and landscape, movement, how existing places shape challenges and opportunities that can inform the vision for change, and where to prioritise setting design standards that recognise what communities have identified as important to them, as well as drawing on the strengths of the place. So on these 2 images, on your left-hand and right-hand side, you can see 2 very different approaches to beginning to analyse places at the scale of the local authority. So on the left-hand side, it maps 15-minute walking and cycling bands to understand the settlement proximity in relation to ease of movement. And on the right-hand side, the local authority is drawn on its former industrial growth patterns, looking at landscape and settlement sizes to inform the area types for prioritising what to code in different settlements across the local authority area. The middle image is a town-wide design code. The image is showing, identifying different area types within the coding plan, following an analysis of industrial growth and heritage assets. But as David highlighted, it's starting to look at the things that you will have in common in those different coding areas. So setting apart the industrial areas from suburban, from town centre, from high-density housing. A really important stage highlighted in the National Model Design Code as critical throughout the coding process is engagement. The pathfinders have engaged widely using digital platforms, but many have also highlighted how in-person events have helped to engage in a more focused way with stakeholders and communities. Wide engagement should consider highways authorities, other local authorities, and developers, as well as seldom heard groups. This slide just shows two examples. The first at the top shows the Pathfinder planning for its engagement across its whole coding process. The second looks at a very thematic engagement and specific stage in the coding process, focusing on understanding people's relationship to the workplace post-pandemic, and what this means for priorities for design codes. For example, in this case, the role of the public realm. This Pathfinder held a series of in-person workshops that followed up on some business surveys and really trying to get into depth to understand what was important to influence the next stages of coding. So this last slide just shows the actual coding stage. So this is where the Pathfinders are now, at their detailed stage of preparing design codes. Here are just a couple of examples, so you can begin to see how the Pathfinder's early analysis and strong overarching vision are informing what to code. You can also see that the role of graphics have in communicating concepts, and that it's important at this stage for the Pathfinders to think about how their applications will be determined using the design code. So the example on the left shows the authority-wide scale code for a large, dense urban area and highlights the opportunities for retrofitting existing Victorian terraces at the homeowner planning application scale. It highlights the importance of elements of built form that inform existing character, but also help to think about how these existing places can change for the better in the future. The example on the right is a rural local planning authority, and they're looking at opportunities for infill development, prioritizing energy efficiency, drawing on examples of rural built form. This example draws on farm building clusters. It considers orientation for solar gain, form factors, for example, terraced housing over detached, and the role of trees for solar shading. So the next steps are really critical. It's important that we gather the learning of what's working well and what is challenging to share widely. But also, I hope what you've learned from this very brief snapshot is that design codes are not about everything looking the same or one particular way of doing things. Bringing design and placemaking to the heart of local planning authorities' plans for change for areas is critical. We need a holistic approach. We need to look at climate, landscape, street design, built form, use. We also need to be able to write precisely with graphic skills and engagement skills. So the rollout will not work without the support of architects and urban designers, at the very least, to work with local planning authorities. So I hope really, following the Minister's speech, this is a bit of a call to arms and an opportunity. So we're now moving on to the next presentations, where we'll have two speakers. First of all, Bob Allies will be speaking, drawing on his experiences as founder of Allies and Morrison, of using design codes, and then he will be followed by Martina, Juvara, Director of Urban Silence, who will be drawing on her experiences, particularly working with communities on a particular master plan. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you. Our practice's involvement with design codes takes two forms. The first is working with local authorities, preparing characterization studies of existing places, and identifying how best to marshal the forces of development and change. These are the sorts of projects that led to our work with Historic England, that in turn resulted in the book Complex City, an attempt to map and characterise London's historical development. The second is working with the private sector, preparing master plans for new development and then providing design codes to control them, something we describe as creating a surrogate context for each new building as it comes forward. In practice, of course, this division between public and private is blurred. When we're working with the private sector, we listen to the local community and engage with the local planners. When we're working with a local authority, we try and understand the aims and aspirations of the local land and building owners. In my 10 minutes today, I thought I might focus on two of our master plans that are now almost fully built out, reflecting on what we've learned from them and on how our experience has informed the way we set about this task now. One of these projects, King's Cross, is local, just a short walk away. The other, Musharraf, is 3,000 miles away in Doha, in another culture and another climate. But this, I think, is what makes it an interesting case study. Working with AECOM and Arab, our specific role in Doha was to shape the architectural character of this new urban quarter. This involved thinking about the materiality of the buildings and about the architectural language that might be deployed. And just as importantly, it meant thinking about the nature of the urban fabric, about the scale and character of the spaces, these being determined above all by the need to create shade and establish enclosure, and thereby make walking not only feasible, but enjoyable. In our codes and parameter plans, we specified building heights and defined building lines. We called for clearly expressed tripartite elevations, bottom, middle, and top. We imposed specific wall-to-window ratios, and we stated where vertical rather than horizontal window proportions should be deployed, in what buildings and in what locations. We stated where colonnades were required and where they weren't. We called for the shading of facades with deep cornices or canopies. We encouraged decoration, but typically restricted its use to soffits, reveals, gates, screens, and brise-soleil. We also defined from what sources the decoration should be drawn. These were generally natural and not traditional. What we wanted to create was a modern and unified piece of city, but one that was grounded in the specific culture and climate of the country. There are 5 points I'd like to make about Musharraf, though. Firstly, that in terms of the creation of a sense of place, the structure of the master plan, with its complex pattern of small-scale streets and squares, was at least as, if not more important, than the building coding. Secondly, that there wasn't a single code that defined the whole area, but rather discrete codes relating to each category of space, something essential, we believe, to the creation of variety and difference within a master plan. Thirdly, in Doha, there was no established local urban morphology or preeminent architectural language to draw on. This effectively was a character that had to be imported or invented. Fourthly, the buildings were all designed by very good architects, not star architects, but ones who were serious, sensitive, and sympathetic to the aspirations of the project. And lastly, Musharraf was carried through by the same client who initiated it. At King's Cross, you might say we exerted much less control. No prescription of materials, or wall-to-window ratios, or glazing proportions, no lexicon of architectural components. But we did define building lines and set maximum building heights and control overshadowing by the use of light cones, particular to different orientations. Just as importantly, as shown in this diagram, we also set minimum building heights to guarantee spatial enclosure. creating successful external spaces, properly contained outdoor rooms, is, I think, impossible without them. When setting these controls, like the authors of the NMDC, we also introduced the idea of percentage compliance. In fact, this is something that we believe could be used far more extensively in design codes as a way of giving flexibility, encouraging diversity, and, maybe this is somewhat contentious, producing a degree of unpredictability. We like to see our master plans as dynamic rather than static. At King's Cross, we allocated uses across the site, but embedded flexibility where we could. We identified where ground floors needed to be active and where they didn't, and we defined where entrances should be located and how buildings were to be serviced. In other words, where were the fronts, where were the backs? But as in Doha, again, our emphasis was less on site-wide codes than on space-specific codes. So every major space, every principal street, and more generically, the side streets and lanes were each individually coded. This is one of the sketches for the space at the southern end of the site between the two stations, setting out clearly the role each building had to play. David Chipperfield's design, with its freestanding columns and deep balconies, captured exactly the sense of frontality that we had called for, conveyed at the time in a stylistically very different manner through a Dimitri Porphyrios watercolour. Importantly, I think, we carried out exactly the same exercise on the perimeter of the site on York Way, in this case to ensure the complete assimilation of the new development into its wider context. Finally, as at Musherreb, the buildings at King's Cross, 56 in total, were again all designed by carefully selected architects and taken through to completion by the same client, Argent. We welcome the aspirations of the new planning framework to create more coherent urban fabric and the clarity of the NMDC in setting out how this might be achieved. And King's Cross and Musherreb have given us some confidence in the potential of this process. But I'd like to end with 3 brief suggestions regarding the coding process that might be helpful, and one final observation. The first I've already referred to, the importance of using codes not just to define areas, but to define individual places, to illuminate the difference between a main street and a side street, to respond to the particular character of a river's edge or the surround to a park, to reinforce the urban hierarchy and generate variety by requiring specificity. The second is that code should ideally be prefaced or followed by an explanatory sentence saying why they have been imposed. This makes it possible in the future for alternatives to be suggested, which would satisfy the requirement in a different way. Not, in my view, a compromise, but an enrichment. The third is a hope that in the future it might increasingly be possible to use coding in the first instance to dictate the environmental performance of the building and allow this to then be the generator of urban character. Rather than saying, for example, that a roof should be pitched or flat, have gables or parapets, or be clad in slate or tile, we should be saying roofs should do a job of reflecting the sun, or generating energy, or harvesting water, or increasing biodiversity, or providing amenity. Or, to take another example, by simply outlawing the detached house. And lastly, my observation. While the identification of distinct area types within the NMDC is enormously helpful, the reality is that the work we do in our practice nearly always happens at the interface of 2 area types, at a moment of transition, both in space and perhaps almost more importantly, in time. This little Flatiron Tower of ours in Southwark Street included as a reference image in the NMDC guidelines, is a case in point. To me then, and I suspect to the authors of the NMDC too, more important than the protection of existing urban typologies or their replication is how we manage their evolution, how we adjust them to accommodate new aspirations and new requirements. This is where imagination and judgment and design inevitably come into play. It is also where an understanding of the trajectory of history is so critical, as well, of course, as an appreciation of the dynamic of change. Thank you.
It's always tough to be the last of a session and being told, oh, we are late. And also it's very tough to talk to a room full of architects after an architectural-led presentation and talk instead about something very different. My presentation is about beauty and communities and who has a say and why a say should be had. I'm the director, I'm an architect, but also I'm a director of a specialist master planning only small practice called Urban Silence. I also have a part of the work that we do is about collaborative planning and is about bottom-up master planning. And I've been working with a range of communities and parish councils. I'm also a trustee and a volunteer for Planning Aid for London, that is an organization that provides advice directly to the community or supports communities to be active and effective in the planning system. So that is where I'm coming from. And in 2011, we won 3 awards for one of the projects that we did, or one of the work that it's not a project in itself, it's a work stream in Gilston, part of the Gilston and Harlow Garden Town. And that is the focus of this presentation. So beauty, to whom does it belong? Who has the right to decide? This is a philosophical point, but it's a very important one, and one that is important to consider overall. And who judges? In the built environment world, of course, in 1933, the Royal Fine Art Commission came into place, and that was substituted by CABE, Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, and then Design Council, and now a range of quality review panels that provide advice. But this has shifted with the time in emphasis. The Royal Fine Art Commission, they were the arbiter of what was good design. They were the final judges and was a panel of experts. And when it was of national significance, they were called in and they were given the final words top down. The Commission for Architecture and Built Environment was fairly different, was about dissemination, was about engaging people and making people understand and appreciate quality of design. And then the Design Council and quality review panels are more peer-to-peer type outfits, that provide peer-to-peer advice on design. But that's not the end of the story. And now here, I'm following up with what the ministers, echoing what the ministers said. But Mr. Gove, just in December last year, issued letters to MPs and to council leaders explaining his vision and the vision of the government. And the words there is beauty or development that is beautiful needs to be engaging the community, it needs to be done with the community. It called for community action through neighborhood plans and local plans. It also even said that the planning inspectorate, the top-down approach, should not override local concerns. And so this is we see over the last 100 years a shift in balance in the built environment. From the commission, from the top down, we decide, we tell you what is good, to going and filtering through peer-to-peer advice, and then now the community has a role. And that, of course, is based on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, mentioned several times already this afternoon. But again, that said, ensure that new housing development meets the needs and expectations of communities. So again, talking about beauty as a shared value, a value in which community need to participate and need to be part of. And is that something that is only related to the built environment, or is something that is also part of the general art discourse? And very much is part of a general appreciation of what art is and what culture is. So here, a quote from the Association for Public Art. Public art is part of our public history, part of our evolving culture and collective memory. So a very clear message. Art, culture, beauty are part of a collective heritage, are part of a shared ownership, and therefore everyone has a role and has a role to play and has a message to give. And also here is a quote that some of you have seen before, if you have seen a presentation of mine. It comes from an Italian industrialist that then later in life turned art collector. If we do not understand that beauty and culture is what makes us human, then we cannot even start to resolve everyday problems. And this, I think, is very telling, is our identity, our humanity, is founded on beauty on one hand, and so is collective, and that is essential to start finding solutions for our future. So then communities, are they able to respond to this call? Are they able to participate into this sort of democratization of what art, culture, beauty, good development is? Personally, I think that it is a little bit beside the point. If they're able, if they have expertise, if they are effective. Development, to be beautiful and meaningful, needs to be shared, needs to be part of the collective heritage that we create. And therefore, it's not whether they are able, it's whether we enable them to contribute effectively. And that is a very important message that I want to give you to all today. What positive contributions communities can make? In my experience, plenty. Of course, they know the places in which they live better than we as professionals, we as experts could ever know. They see the same place over the years, how it changes, the same street, how it has evolved, how the community is changing, how the lifestyle has changed. But also they see it in cold days, hot days, early morning, late night, late at night. And so their perception and their understanding of a place is very deep and is a huge resource for us. Also, when they express concern, and this is, for example, working with the Planning Aid for London groups, their concerns are very real and very practical and very founded. Of course, there is skepticism, there is maybe fear of change, but that is very legitimate, of course. But whenever they say that the local environmental areas are being overstretched, is probably real. And when they say that the local character is not respected, is also very real. And eventually, also, they are the people that are the most invested in the success of a place in the future. They have invested their homes, they have invested their savings in the place, and therefore they have a right to express a view and to be heard. Now coming to the Gilstone area, that's the project that won the 3 awards in 2021. That is it's a community-led, of course, it's a neighborhood plan for 10,000 homes. So for new development, is the neighborhood plan, the focus of the neighborhood plan is for the new 10,000 homes, part of the Harlow and Gilstone Garden Town. So this is Harlow, as you can see there on the map. And here at the top in the circle is the Gilstone area. The diagram was done by Allan and Morrison and was done for the garden town as part of a fairly engaged community participation in establishing the vision for the area. The concept for the development is 7 villages in the landscape, as you can see fairly clearly from the diagram. So although it's part of the garden town and it's 10,000 homes out of the 23,000, so the majority of the homes plans for Harlow, is designed and is conceived very differently. 7 villages set in the landscape, contemporary in design, inspired by local character as well, and with 60% of all transport to be provided by sustainable modes. This raises all sorts of questions. So what is a village? How do you design a new village? What is local character? Who describes that and how to describe that? How can it be contemporary and still be reflective of local character? How different should it be if it is essentially sustainable modes of transport? So these are some of the questions that the neighborhood plan started to address. And it has here, I don't want to go into the details, but these are sets of policies that are part of the neighborhood plan. The first group is about the structure of how you create these 7 villages and how the villages should sit in the landscape. The second group is the quality places, so is how the villages in themselves, each village, should be designed to create character. And then the third part is about implementation and the relationship between the community and the place. So the 3 critical aspects, focus of the neighborhood plan were landscape setting, so the relationship between the built form and the landscape. So not so much, nobody locally was concerned about the materials or the fenestration, the shape of the windows or things like that. They were very much concerned about the relationship between the green spaces and how the built environment sits into the green spaces. Also, what is a village? What makes a village? A lot of soul searching went and a lot of scoping of what makes a village compared to a suburb or a neighborhood. And then also how the long-term relationship with the community in terms of stewardship and governance and how the new communities would be integrated into the existing ones. In particular, there was a policy AG6, that described the character and how to create to be distinctive. So this was in a way a dream policy because it gave the priority. The relationship between built environment and landscape was the key, and the rest was secondary. And following that, there was an appendix that was not a design code, but was the foundation, the stage 1, if you want, of a design code. So was the definition of what makes local character in various ways. So how the structure of a village takes place, what is the street character, and how is different from the suburbs, how the landscape is part of the village or part of the built environment itself, how landmark buildings sit in the landscape, or sit in the built form. So all of these elements are the foundation of a potential design code. The community then decided not to do a design code for 3 main reasons. 1, exhaustion, just too much effort. 2nd, lack of funding. They would have had to fundraise possibly for a year, and so that would have delayed the neighborhood plan. And then 3rd was that they judged that it would be impossible to do the design code without engaging with the developers and the architects working for the developers, and that engagement wouldn't come. So were the Gilston community, or are they, truly empowered to make a positive difference? Is the setting that is now in place positive, creating a positive experience? I must say it's not. It was for them a very frustrating experience, very frustrating to see that their perspective is not respected, that even the disruption, the construction period will last for the rest of their lives, or from the children will be born and leave home, and the construction will still be going on, and that has not been recognized. Also, the reluctance to accept this massive change and the time effort. They calculated that the equivalent of 1 person working full-time for 10 years is the amount of volunteering work that they did to prepare the neighborhood plan and to respond and to engage with the development. So a huge amount of work and a huge amount of emotional effort that is not recognized. But also, very importantly, their voices are drowned out all the time. They are belittled by the developers' consultants, saying that the neighborhood plan doesn't really count as a real plan, or being told, oh, we don't have to explain this, our transport strategy to you. It's too complicated for you to understand. These are real, this happened, this is real. This is what they experienced after they prepared and wrote and scoped the whole of the characterization of the area and all of the policies to guide the development. This is what they were told. Also, the local authorities afraid to reject the development proposal, and therefore not asking for alternatives, not asking when the proposals and the design guidance and the parameter plans come forward, and they are not in compliance with the neighborhood plan. The local authorities are saying, yes, but we can't really ask for an alternative. We asked for an alternative. Developers decided not to present one. What can we do? We can only judge what it is in front of us. And again, this is real discussion of why communities are not valued. Their representations were never fully answered, and now next month they are offered 10 minutes. The outline planning application has been in for 4 years. There will be an 8-hour-long development management meeting, and the community that prepared a neighborhood plan, that is very well organized, that is very skilled, is given 10 minutes to put forward their case. And this is obviously not collective creation. So what can DLUHC and what the Office for Place can do for it? Well, first of all, is understanding, and this is just maybe a beside point, or maybe I'll skip it, but housing is not the only, we have this pressure for housing, but it's not the only issue. We have really to work with communities and recognize and enable communities to become partners. Recognize that there is an anti-community discrimination. It's sufficient to say, oh, communities are naysayers. Communities are all NIMBYs. This is something that is unacceptable. It's not true. Communities are vested in their space. Communities know the place very well. Communities are wishing for success, and therefore they have to be enabled to make a contribution. And also, I hope, embed community partnership in legislation, not just consult and then move on, tick the box and then move on, enable communities to be able to make a difference. And what architects can do? Plenty. Work for the collective. Recognize that beauty is a collective heritage that we are collectively creating. And listen to what people say. Respect their perspective. Accept to go on guided site visit at Gilston when the community offered to take people around and show them how the place was beautiful. The architects sent their junior designers. None of the senior people went. Get to know the site, we localize, and understand the local perspective. And also recognize then when people choose, like in this famous, the Marmalade Lane co-housing development, when people are the client, normally developments work really well. Thank you.